Well, I was born out in Englewood or up around Cherryland, where the old trolley used to, horse-drawn trolley went. And at Quincy and Broadway, basically, one block off. And lived here most of my life, other than when military got a hold of me. And then I spent a couple of years down in the Dominican Republic in the Caribbean. And another couple of years out in Iowa, and then came back to Colorado. And my Iowa stint was a little crop spraying operation. A friend of mine's dad had a drinking problem, and he had the standard station at Quincy and Broadway. And he'd robbed the till, took off, left her with the station. And so I just happened to be old enough at the time on the weekend to help her pump gas and run the stations. And this is the end of the Depression. And she paid me $5 for my helping her that day. And some of us kids were hanging around at the little airport, which is right at Stapleton Field, across the fence from it, the old Walt Hiegling Field. And they called it the Civil Air Patrol Field. All of the private airplanes had to be grounded during the war, except under that. And as teenagers, a couple of us were interested in flying airplanes. So we'd go out and watch the airplanes flying. Well, with this $5 burning a hole in my pocket, I could take a flight lesson for $8 an hour, or I could take a half hour. And that's all it took, was that half hour. And so then I told my dad I was going to learn to fly. And he said, "You stay away from those things, they're dangerous." Well, you know what a teenager does. Well, at the same time, the instructor was an instructor at the Inglewood Trade School, machine shop. And he said, "Why don't you come out here and join and learn to run the machines, or lathes and so forth." And I thought, well, that sounded like a good idea. So he cornered about a half a dozen of us the same way. And about that time, they had a contract with the Navy contract, and we're making the hose couplings. And with they're various sizes or something. Once you got to where you could run a lathe, well, then they put you on that if you wanted to. Well, that paid 35 cents an hour, but that's the way I paid for my flying lessons. And so I had to wait till I was 16 to solo, and that was 1944. And so I continued on, finally earned my private license about the following year, and then about 2 years later, I got my commercial pilot license. And I was building time any way I could without having to pay for it by ferrying airplanes for some of the salespeople, and ultimately with an air show. And so they were traveling all over the country had extra airplanes that needed to be moved, and so that's the way I built my time. And about then, that was when the Korean War broke out, and some of my friends, they decided they didn't want to be drafted, so they went out to the National Guard, and they said, "You better come out." I said, "Well, I'll wait till they breathe down my neck." Well, they did. And that's so I went in, I think it was the 4th of August. And of course, I was number first one in the to receive my draft notice, number 10 in my area. And so I went down and told them I wanted to enlist in the Air Force, wanted to fly. And of course, I didn't have the college they needed for that. And you had to be a commissioned officer. And so anyway, they said, well, your best bet's your artillery. And that was a lot, really, but they signed me up with that. And what that did do, though, was it kept me from going to Korea. I would have been over there about in October in '50. And the Colorado contingent, I heard later, that took heavy casualties at that period of time over there. And about then, well, I guess in during '51, yeah, they were getting heavy casualties in Korea. And they had a real badly injured individual, and they called on the Navy for a helicopter, and they were flying the R-4 Sikorskys that they used to pick up down pilots. And so they then started getting more and more calls from the Army because that worked out so well. And then they got to the point they were being swamped and taken away for the Army for what they needed to be doing for down pilots. They were either going down behind enemy lines or in the water out there. And they advised the Army that the chief surgeon that they needed to get their own helicopters in if they could. And this, well, I don't want to jump ahead, but apparently the helicopters they were getting was the A model Bells. They had the wheels on them. And as it turns out, I was going through my card file recently, and I ran across an old acquaintance who had been a engineer for Bell helicopters and helped to design certain parts of it, design engineer. And so he went over initially with one of those early helicopters and found out the wheels weren't working well on the side slopes where they're having to land. And they could only carry one individual with usually walking wounded, and somebody real badly injured just didn't fit inside. Well, anyway, he redesigned out in the field there, he said, and came up with the skids. And that also provided place to put litters on each side. And that was a gentleman named him of Alan Price was the engineer. And so he went over. Well, anyway, that went over well. They started equipping more and more of the MASH hospitals with helicopters. And there was getting to be more and more demand for the helicopters. The commanders found that it was real useful, especially the regional commanders could get out and talk to his units better with the small helicopters. And then they were beset by a lot of mechanical problems. Because basically, these helicopters were a little more than experimental, really, at that time. And anyway, between maintenance problem, trying to keep aircraft in the air, and a shortage of helicopters, anyway, from '51 to '53, or when the armistice, 27th of July, they had, I forget the exact numbers on the thing, so I hate to be quoted on them, but they had evacuated over 4,000 some casualties, even with these little small bills. And of course, they apparently were upgraded as the time went with later model helicopters. We were training in that type down at Fort Sill, and on a hot day there, the rear wheels would come off the ground about 2 inches, and with a load of gas and the instructor in there, the front wheels were firmly on the ground, so that was hover. So that gives you an idea of what those pilots were dealing with over in Korea trying to make medevacs. Now the thing that they talked about a little bit to us, they had a technique was developed by the autogyros. Pitcairn had a system, apparently they could wind it up a certain percent over normal RPM that they auto-rotated, and they made a jump takeoff, and then the propeller pulled them into forward flight. Well, they were teaching us to do the same thing, and that's probably what they were doing in some cases. We even used that technique with our larger helicopters. If you were in rocky terrain or brush or something where we couldn't make running takeoffs, then you'd take it up to the top RPM, pull it up, and settle into forward flight. As you're moving forward, you have additional lift, and that's what you hoped you got into. Or most of our flying was running takeoffs, and we could carry our heaviest load that way. And we were set up to carry 6 litters internally, and we could, as fuel burned off and we became lighter, we could carry 2 additional walking wounded. So it's between 6 to 8 people per trip. And that of course increased the number that could be done per hour. And our unit, well, I have to back up because the class I was in was divided in half later on, and that became the 6th helicopter company. And the second half was Class B, which became the 13th. And apparently the Army didn't want the enemy to know how many helicopter units were out, so that supposedly was the reason for the odd number that we were given at the time. And so one was the 6th and ours was the 13th. That was another thing too, that whatever company was assigned the job, the other company became a support. So if we got to such, you might even call for the whole company, give support. But that's the way it was. The 13th would be the backup for the 6th, or the 6th for the 13th. Kind of a sidebar on that, somebody in our unit contacted Walt Disney, and we thought we'd have some nose art like they had in the bombers. And so Walt Disney Studios did design a logo there with Lucifer the cat springing down, superimposed on the 4-leaf clover. And we had it on our helicopters. Well, we were told we couldn't have them. We had to cover those up because they didn't want the units identified. The 6th, since they were equipped with helicopters first, which actually became our helicopters. They trained in ours, and then they got the brand new ones to come over. Well, I was still at Fort Sill at the time, and they'd been back east at Bragg doing a pre-war war games type thing to prep them for Korea. And I was sent to Bridgeport, Connecticut to be checked out by factory pilots in the Sikorsky. And my instructor in the little Bells and Hillas we trained in had about 30 hours. Had just cleared the course ahead of me. And so then I was given about 30 hours and soloed. And here again, I've gotten way ahead of myself too. But the washout rate was we started out with about 300 people we mustered in, and they said, look to the right and look to the left. One of you won't be there next week. And that's the way it turned out. And a lot of the first group were bomber pilots. We had B-24 pilots. We had some fighter pilots. One had flown with the British in the Eagle Squadron, flying Spitfires. And I think I had one that flew the Bearcats, carrier pilot. And Harry, I think he said he flew 24s and ultimately into B-29s, checked out in them. And he said he even got to go one time on a co-pilot place on a P-36. But these were all retreads and some had stayed in, and so that's what the offer was for military pilots and as civilian private or better grade. And so I was one of the few younger pilots, really, outside of those bomber pilots. We wound up going to Korea with little more than, I think I had about 60-some total hours, which, looking back on it, that's practically nothing. But that's the way it was. We were learning on the job. Well, we were at graduation. We were told that General Heidelman or something, I think that was his name. He said that you gentlemen will be the future of the helicopter program, and what we do would be the future of the helicopters. And then when we took them to the factory, and then they took them down to the seaport, they supposedly prepped them for overseas shipment, and they screwed the whole thing. They'd have been better off. We'd have been flyable over there 30 days before we were, because of part of this screw up that took place.
What did they do that?
Well, I don't know if they treat things for salt air corrosion and different things, and then they apparently dumped a bunch of junk in the fuel cells, and the fuel tanks aren't tanks, so to speak. They're a bladder, neoprene bladder, and they put kind of like putting creosote into the fuel, your car tank. Well, I almost had one quit, I guess, prior to getting everything operational. And they had to pull all of those things out and put brand new ones in. So that was an emergency deal to get it from the States. And so they had to go in and do that. And then according to Army's procedures, we hadn't been flying for 30 days from the time we left. And the Army does things strange in strange ways. So we were the first of what they called at that time the cargo helicopters. And well, that's a small ship compared to what they're flying today, but at that time, the H-19, as it turns out, had just came into line at about the opening of the Korean War. So the Bell and the Sikorsky both were very green new helicopters. And I'm sure we were working way beyond their limits. But we did manage to pull it off. And I'd have to get my book out to give you some actual numbers, but what we ultimately did fly out over there. And they had the first prisoner of war, I think, was I think it's called a Skyhook. One was a thing that I think the Army set up is to find out what we could do, and so we were carrying sling loads. Well, the sling load, we could only carry about half of what we could internally. And they were useful when there were places you couldn't land, up on the mountains, side slope, and so forth. And for a troop carrier or medevac, of course, the internal, we were on wheels, so we usually operated either on the dikes of the rice paddies. In the wintertime, we could fly off the rice paddies, which was very good because they're smooth and they weren't always real big, but they were big enough for us to take off in. Toward the end of the war, they finally got we got the demodeled at the end of our training over there. And that was this. The first ones were 160 horsepower Franklin. And then the demodeled came out, and that was a 200 horse engine. And in later series, I've flown their later series in the civilian life, but they were no different than the military. Anyway, originally they had 4 wheels on the things. The front 2 were casters, full casters. And they did have brakes that didn't work. They were kind of a hand lever you pulled to set the brakes. And it just wasn't working good on the side slopes. One of our first trips since our unit we were based just east of Uijeongbu, about 3 miles east of Uijeongbu. And we were the 6th Helicopter Company was located up at Chuncheon. Well, we were closest to Panmunjom, so we had the duty to fly up the negotiators in and out of Panmunjom. And the first flight came back in, and they said, you're going to have to put bright yellow stripes on these helicopters. They're the ones that were to fly in and out of Panmunjom. So the Chinese knew who was coming and going. And so much for the identification of the helicopters. So we would pull the duty to fly in and out. But there was 22 aircraft per company. So it was 44 pilots per unit. So the duty was spread around with all of us. So every 3 or 4 weeks, you'd draw the duty to go to Panmunjom and to be up there for out of the base up there for about a week. Then you'd rotate out, and then new pilots would take over. So we did that through the balance of the war until the negotiation was finally over. My particular place was on the Christmas Hill area at Hill 1065, and that's one of the higher mountains. They're 3,000 feet, but for us that was at that time with the loads, that's about the best we could do, density, altitude, and everything. But we hauled in 1,000 troops, and it was the first mass troop deployment by the Army. And also, and not just where I was at, but pardon me, they were spread out to various positions they need to be.
Were you under fire from the enemy at times?
Pardon?
Were you under fire from the enemy when you were flying?
They said that up on Hill 1065 that we were under fire until we crossed over the hill. My first trip in there, they said that they'd had 4 mass wave attacks that night, and they were completely out of ammunition, and they were going after the ammo before they're going after any food and water. But they had. So anyway, we were flying in troops into various positions, and they said that to get over the ridge as soon as you can because you're under fire. And I couldn't see any tracers or anything going by me, and nothing hit us, so I can't tell you whether I was being shot at or not. And I've landed in places where I've had artillery coming down close by, but one case we're over on the I'm going to say it's close to the Bloody Hill area. I can't say for sure at the time, but I was picking up casualties there. And I just asked the doctor, I said, how secure are you at this point? And he said, we're about 3,000 yards beyond max range. Well, he hadn't even more than got the words out of his mouth and 3 rounds come in. About 200 yards away from us. There's a small airstrip, and the airplanes, they jumped in them, and boys like hitting a box of a bunch of pigeons or something flying out. Well, once they were gone, I told the doctor, I said, well, I think my helicopter and your 10 are the biggest targets. And as it turns out, looked over where the rounds came down, and here was a couple guys laying there in the grass. Well, the medics ran over there, and it turns out that was a Chinese OP. Otherwise, I'm sure we would have taken some fire from next. But it was just because the medics thought they were wounded GIs, and they called those rounds right practically on top of themselves.
Did you pick those guys, the Chinese, up too?
No, I already had a load of GIs, so I finally got loaded up and headed on back. So that's one peculiar thing about flying. You don't hear those noises, at least in this case. We weren't authorized to carry out bodies. The medics had to decide who had the best chance of making it. And I wasn't sure a lot of the guys did, but at least the medics put them on board. They weren't supposed to put a corpse on board because they considered the helicopter too valuable for that particular type of duty. We weren't armed and we weren't flying. Due to the scarcity of the helicopters, part of the scarcity was created by the military's bureaucracy with a chain of command, and then over to the Air Force, who was doing the heavy maintenance. The helicopter needing parts for the helicopter was low on their priority list. So it was a real foobar setup. And I'm sure that's why they ultimately, and I'm not sure when it took place, but it became its own branch, helicopter branch, like the artillery and so forth. But we had initially we were told we were carrying in 1,000 troops into blocking positions. And in the book here it says 750. so I have to take with that. And still, I've got pictures. Unfortunately, at the time, I could only get, at times I could get color, at times I could get black and white. Well, I made the mistake of having the black and whites developed over there. Well, their fixers and things were bad. So that's my problem. My pictures are all disappearing, unfortunately. But and especially on this last battle, when we're flying, you can't take pictures.
Yeah.
When we're up and flying, sometimes if we're going straight and level, I could lock the collective down to where it wouldn't move, lock the throttle down, and then kind of hold the stick in my knees and get and most of the time, I just tried to keep the camera set in a neutral position, and that's what I'd shoot. It was a little, started out with one camera and later on got a little Zeiss-Icon that folded up. And that was a good little camera. So anyway, the first battle that I was involved in, and they're basically one and the same. One was due north of where we were based. But anyway, it's about 10 to 15 miles north of Weijongbu. And outpost area, I think they called it. Well, it was that whole area that I think there was 600 and some killed in action on that particular area, and almost 1,000 wounded in action. Well, our unit apparently was been called in on it. I didn't get up there during the daytime, but I got up there just before dark. And fortunately, or I'd never found the ridge. The highway was on one side, and then the ridge was up, and then it came to a iron triangle, I think they called it, along the DMZ. And so this doctor had his position just off the hill, and they were bringing him down there about as fast as we could make a round trip. And I carried out, as near as I can figure, about 140 to 150 Medivacs before we ran out of fuel. And I told the doctor, I said, I'm out of fuel, this is my last trip. And he said, well, you got to come back. And I said, well, I will, I've got to. But anyway, as I loaded up, and you could tell how the helicopter normally had a feel for when it's loaded coming off. And I was probably running about 200 to 300 feet before it come airborne. And on this particular trip, I was running about 3 or 4 times that distance. And the helicopter jets are shouting and shaking and clawing for air at max power. And it was about a 5 or 6 minute flight back to the hospital train. And so my max continuous power was about 5 minutes. And I was able to back off a little bit from it, but I figured once I was airborne, I might as well keep going. And once I got in the air, the crew chief called up and said 18 of them had crawled in down there. Now, how in the world 18 of them ever crawled into that box, I'll never know. They must have been hanging outside. And I noticed a larger than normal group going by, but they're all walking wounded type. But if that was the case, we had literally 3 loads in one. Of course, I was out of gas, which lightened up the aircraft. But if that is true, then that number goes up to 150. But all the way I go by that is the number of landings on my flight sheet. And I showed 144 landings, so Uh, the two of those would have been coming and going, and the rest would have been round trips. So it's about 21 round trips.
Gosh.
And anyway, then the second major battle was up on Hill 1065, where we hauled in all of the troops. In between the battles, it seemed like we were still carrying medevacs from different places. Even after the truce was signed, I'd carry out at least 4 or 5 that I'd be sent off to, and some of them are mines and things, and there's skirmishes apparently from hostilities across the lines. They had an article in one of the later VFW magazines that there was a lot more that went on. We weren't hearing about it up till present day.
Tell us a little bit more about the helicopter, how fast you could go, how many people you could carry, and how far back were these runs back to the MASH units from the front lines?
How far back? Our base was probably about from here to Lafayette, or about 8-10 miles back behind the lines. And that was a curiosity to me. I've been flying ammo and supplies into this one deal. I think it was called Cook's Castle. Is looking at the map. I don't recall the name for sure, but I'd hauled in the last load, and I think the captain come up and asked me if I wanted a cup of coffee, and well, that sounded good for after hauling in all morning, and it wasn't until then that I could hear machine gun fire. And as far as I was flying in blue sky weather, so. But the other side of it was meeting the people up on the front line, and you can spot that somebody that has been in combat on a daily day, especially. And we go 10 miles back behind the lines, and there's kids back there that they were stateside. It's just an entirely different environment. And flying to and from within minutes, it was real drastic. And that's one thing that struck me over there. But we flew, other projects was, my very first flight in there when I arrived from the States. They just brought in some wounded at the 44th MASH. And the one young individual had stepped on mines. I think the Chinese or North Koreans during the night would go out and put mines out in those trails. And can you imagine having to go out on patrol? They had the same thing in Vietnam when they knew that they're liable to step on a mine or they're traps. And this was the case. This young individual had lost both legs, one below the knee on the left and above the knee. Of course, got shot, and his right arm was mangled, so I don't know if they saved that or not. But I was right fresh out of stateside. So that was my introduction into the war. And you just can't imagine it unless you're there. And those guys on the line, no one is this the day I get it or not.
That
So-
ammunition was really important, wasn't it, in getting ammo up to them? And
Pardon?
it was really important for you to get that ammunition up. Just
Well,
those
up
few
on the hill
miles.
it was. They said they were completely out. Said if they had one more wave of coming at them, they'd have lost it. And we hauled out for the better part of the next week. We were there for resupply. We had about 3 aircraft stood by down below yeah, for whatever the needs might be at the dam. And so as we haul supplies in, we might haul some casualties out. And I think we hauled out about 300 casualties that day, that week. And that was just about 2 days. At the end of that was 2 days before that truce was signed. A lot of people got killed for nothing.
People think about the TV show, MASH. They think about a glorified field hospital and that kind of thing. What did you think of that TV series when it came out?
Well, I didn't like it at first, and I have to go back into a little deal that when we're on board the ship, going over, and I've met this other young doctor, young guy. Well, we were all young, about 22 years old, and he had just got out of dental school. He'd been in the Army 2 weeks, long enough to get uniforms and shots and on board the ship, and I think the doctors were the same way. They were drafted, or in a lot of cases fresh out of school, or maybe I don't know what the law can do as far as the government, whether they can go in and tell the doctor and induct them into the army military. So for that respect, a lot of those guys had no military training whatsoever or bearing about them. I was able to walk into 44th MASH Hospital while they were drilling into the guy's head. I only did that once, and I never went back in again. I don't know how the doctors can stand to be, and nurses for that matter, to be exposed to those, that type of thing. And they did bring that out in some respect in the MASH program. So yes, I think I've put a little credence in what it was. Now, because they weren't military trained, they were, as far as I know, they were just a bunch of happy-go-lucky Americans over there, and I guess they had to kind of, it was their way of dealing with the trauma they were dealing with. And I can imagine being like after you got to thinking about it, like these guys would get to joking and horse playing. And we did the same thing, I think, with our group. In the off duty, we're sitting around the tents playing chess or different games. And so it was, for us, it was different than the ground, somebody being on the ground. I'd look around and see those guys in mud and water down those trenches and things in that cold weather. We were staying in a tent. The tent about the size of this room, I guess, for 6 of us. And there are 2 pot-belly stoves. We weren't supposed to turn them up as high, but we had them up to where they were cherry red. And you'd have to stand within about 2 foot of them and then just do a rotisserie to keep warm. So, but we were better than they were out on the ground.
The cargo helicopters that you were flying, how fast could they fly? How many people could you carry on a normal basis?
Well, we could, I've got a picture of, well, when we could take on the extra walking wounded, along with the litters, with pilot, co-pilot, and crew chief, it was a 10-place helicopter. Normally we carried 6 litters, was what we could carry, and then the walking wounded, providing the fuel load was down. We were set up initially for pilot and co-pilot in the helicopters. The 13th, there for a while, discontinued, and we flew single pilot for flights. The sixth up there, they continue flying both pilots. And the one reason was we could save weight. And in other words, another person we could carry. And we weren't under combat condition where they're being shot at. In other words, like they were doing in Vietnam, where they're going into hot LZs, and in some cases the other pilot had to bring it back. And however, it wasn't a case of one being a co-pilot and one being the captain of the one pilot would have the mission going out. You just change seats, and so then he'd be the pilot, and so you're flying the time equal time basically, as pilot or co-pilot.
What kind of airspeed did you have?
And it seemed like I'm going to answer it a different way, but it didn't seem like the helicopter would ever fly faster than 60 or 70 miles an hour. And that's because of the advancing and retreating rotor blade. Now Sikorsky has got, and I think the French and the Russians, I just read an article the other day, have got helicopters, compound helicopters, that have flown over 300 some miles an hour. And the twin-rotored helicopters, if you stop and think about the advanced rotor blade and the retreating rotor blade, well, it dates back to the autogyro period. And even before the Wright brothers, there had been many attempts at building rotorcraft. In fact, Sikorsky, as a young man, tried to build a rotorcraft or something. He didn't have the power and so forth and controls or anything else, but he was trying to develop something, prove that he could fly. Well, it goes back to an Italian over in Italy. And one of the problems they had with the early autogyros was as they'd start to move, that things would roll over. Well, they didn't understand what was going on. And this one-day Severo was an engineer building airplanes back in just not too long after Wright brothers flew. And of course, they didn't understand stall, getting too slow, so forth. And airplanes were crashing, And so he decided that he would make a windmill and put it on, and the things still had wings on them. And that later ones, they were like ailerons out there, but they're wings, so to speak, to keep it from rolling. Well, as he was flying one day, the must have been fairly low because one of the blades failed. And when it failed, he survived it. Well, then being an engineer, he said, well, why did it fail? Then he realized what happened. The metal, then the bending loads eventually caused things to break. So he decided, well, what he needed was a hinge. Put a door hinge or a flapping hinge, so to speak. And when he did, and guess what? The autogyro no longer tended to roll over. This was one little deal that the building the helicopter has been of multiple stages of little advancements. Somebody's come along that's caused it to improve it. And then that eventually evolved into Sikorsky's early version. He tried a lot of different things, trying to keep it from rolling. And even had a back on the tail. Of course, you've got to have a counter rotation of turning the main rotor. and they decided on that. Well, then if he needed something to be able to make it go forward or tilt it one way or the other, so he had booms with vertical deals, and that was going on. Well, anyway, at some point, apparently he made contact with this Severo. He had heard about his success with the auto gyros, and bought some patent rights to it, and that was another little piece that Sikorsky needed to, and ultimately he was able to then get away with those extra outriggers. And another thing that Sierra sold his patent then to an auto gyro builder here in the country, and that was Pitcairn, made some of the first auto gyros. And they've I think got a through license with Sierra. They came up with a deal of tilting the rotor, and they had the big long arm coming down that they could tilt it. A lot of these home-built gyros are using the same thing. And well, the helicopters are doing the same thing, only aerodynamically. And but anyway, the speed seemed like it was never going to be much faster than 60 or 70 miles an hour due to the rolling deal. One thing I had during that the flying the communist bloc troops in, we had a regular daisy chain going of every helicopter that they could put in the air. We flew over 3,000 of them off of aircraft carriers in Incheon Harbor up to the DMZ because Sigmund Reeve wouldn't allow them overland because they were communist bloc troops. And so we had a daisy train, the combination between the troop and the POWs returning. I think we total people we transported was over 7,000 people between the different, as the Skyhook and the different operations we had, returning POWs coming back and so forth. But, and then I forget how many million pounds of that's in the book here, but for 45, that was all done in 45 days during that period. And the original group, I think the 6th was involved in that. That was before when we got over there. And they went in up to Panmunjom and flew them out from there back to Seoul area. When we were there, they brought them back to Munsan, and they called it Freedom Village. They had a hospital set up there at the time. They'd go in, and the doctors check them over and so forth, and treat them if they needed treating. Some of them were in pretty bad shape in letters, and some of them were, I don't know, I think a lot of them were all bomber flight crew where they're being shot down behind the B-29s up there. And anyway, there was, oh gosh, I wish they had numbered another 2,000 or 3,000 people. They brought them back in ambulances to this place. We had our heliport was set on the hill just above there. And then as they were being processed, they'd bring them up on the hill and we would fly them back to Seoul. And either the hospitals if they needed to be here, or maybe they all went in. And some probably went to Kempo where they were flown back to Japan, possibly even the States, depending upon their physical condition. But anyway, basically we were flying them back to Seoul.
How reliable were the helicopters? Did you have a lot of mechanical breakdowns, and what about the crews that would work on them if you weren't able to fly them?
Well, early helicopters were just that. They were a little more than experimental, really. The Sikorsky had a little bit more of it was a little better built than the early Bells were. You know, I remember going through on flight training that the little Bells, even what I was used to, they just weren't a real refined product. And they've evolved, I think, while we're there. We were the training, or that's where they were finding out what problems they had and what they needed. In other words, of course, it was obvious they needed more power to start with, and eventually they got there. And then of course the other part of the problem was the getting parts was the big problem. A helicopter, it could go down for a bolt, one of the special bolts that's holding something together, and it'd be grounded until they could get it. And through the bureaucracy they were Army had, and then they was going, not only that, but going through the Air Force, and it had to be a heck of a mess. And I think that was one of the big arguments when they wanted to break the helicopter program away from the Army aviation part. Well, it was still part of that, but it still became its own branch. And since I was away from it, I don't know exactly when that came into being, but they got new type uniforms and to distinguish them from the rest of the crowd. And they're the ones that were flying into hot LZs and things. My hat's really, they were taking real, such high casualties for pilots, flight crew, that George said they were having a real hard time getting people even signed up for the program. I just headed out this one morning, and I'd made several trips previous days, but this day I was hearing a clicking sound in the gearbox, and I knew that wasn't normal. I turned around and went back in, and I wrote it up. We have two methods. Usually on a squawk, you could write it up with a slash, and that's something that you want to take a look at and you're not sure about. But and the other one is you put it one the other way. You've got a red X, or you mark it red X. If you don't have the red ink, well, you write it as red X. And I wrote the thing up about 2 times trips before and came back in. And I'm not sure that there was a whole lot the mechanics really could do with it in the field. And I don't know that they had magnetic chip detectors, like with a lot of times you'll have modern cars, and if you get metal chips, then something's breaking down maybe. And or look at the oil and see if you can see any in the sunlight. Usually, some indication of metal particles in it. And that would have been about the only thing they could have done really over there, other than open it up and looking into it. Well, the Army doesn't do that. They'll take the part off and send it in and exchange it. So anyway, on this third morning, they hadn't changed a thing on it. Like, it just came in. And as I lowered the collective pitch, boy, all heck broke loose in it. Just loud pop and bang and crunch. And I think it was a bolt probably that came down and was going through the gears. Well, the main rotor, there's a lot of inertia there. And I think that if we'd have been flying another 5 minutes, we probably wouldn't be here talking to you. Because the transmission was literally devouring itself up. Due to a bolt, I think is what it was.
And you'd been flying with it that way before.
Yeah, well, and I don't know how many had been flying it before, but I knew that I didn't want to fly it with that, hearing that kind of a noise in it. And I think the CO was probably looking down his nose at me about that point. You know, we were just flying pastures, wasn't going into any combat deal, because you hear stories about people having engine problems and things, and that's usually something like this. One guy that went to Germany that had one case with this individual who had been working his operation. And we had an order to fly a bunch of blood plasma out to this one field. You can't call it a hospital, but that's basically a tent. And so we had everything we could put into 3 helicopters, and he was leading the flight. Since he was boss man, he was going to lead the flight. Well, we got out to about where we were supposed to be. They usually give us coordinates, map coordinates, longitude and latitude, and that worked real good. It just mattered. They were almost always there. Well, anyway, he said, no, the map's wrong here. We got within about 3 miles of where we're supposed to be, and it landed. Well, we had 4 other pilots there that should have been. They were, I guess, he had them buffaloed. That finally, after about 20 minutes, I told him, look, I said, that place is right over the hill, and I'm going to deliver my load. Because that was his flight. He was leading in the ship with me, leading the flight. And he provided his part, leading the pilot going out. So now was my flight going back. I told the crew chief, I'd get on board. We're going over and deliver a load, which I did. The mechanic, the place was a lousy place for the helicopter, but it's literally a hole in the trees. And it's big enough to land in, but we couldn't carry a load out of it. But we got there, and the doctor said, boy, we're glad to see you. But we're beginning to take blood out of themselves. And they were needing that stuff real bad. And so we offloaded, went back over and told the rest of them, I said, the place is exactly where the map says it is. And so got this other pilot on board, and we went on back. Anyway, we returned to base, and I guess the rest of them found their way back too, because I didn't wait for them.
How many helicopters did you lose out of your squadrons during the time?
We only, we had Jack Roberts, who was the Brit that had flown the Spitfires, and then later on with the Air Force, when the U.S. got into the battle over there. He was out with his student. So we were getting new pilots in from the States, and the controls into the main rotor system, each blade has an arm that feathers the blade. And so each one, no matter how many blades they all have the same. Well, anyway, the pitch change length failed. So then the blades went wild and just came apart. So he was, Jack and that new pilot, I never did. I don't know if I ever met the new guy. Were the only 2 killed over there. technically, we had one other individual that went over with us, and I don't know if any point mention his name here, but when we first arrived over there at Danchon, he was, you could tell he was real nervous about being over there. Well, he was the only son, surviving son, and he got himself removed from the combat zone. Well, they apparently sent him over to Germany, and about 2 months later, we heard he was killed over there. So technically, we had 2 fatalities with our group, but yes and no. Because he was in Germany, we couldn't really count him, but he didn't escape the bullet. One guy I had coffee with said that he was over in Germany, and he come close to signing up, but he said they were actually offering W-2s to anybody would sign up. And later on, he said they were signing W-4s now. Now that's hearsay, so I can't prove that, but they were desperate. George even said if we didn't solo within 30 hours, I think that was high time, they were worst out. And George said some of those guys were up to 100 hours. Now, if he's that bad off, he shouldn't be a pilot in the first place.
Who was George now?
He was my brother-in-law. I met my wife there at Fort Bragg, and she was living there with them. And George himself he was on the Hornet when it was launched the bombers. It bombed Tokyo. He turned 16 that day. So was more or less orphaned. I think he left home because he was having trouble with his dad or something, and wound up in this one little town, I guess. Needed something to eat and clothes or whatever. And they said there was a gentleman there, the mortician of the town, took him in. And so he worked helping the mortician until I guess he decided he'd like to join the Navy, which he did. And mortician signed for him as being his sponsor. And that's the way he got in. He lied about his age. And so said he was 16 when they launched the bombers.
He'd be a story, wouldn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, so
He was honored up until they had to jump off of it too when they got involved in that battle, and the ship didn't actually get sunk at that point, but it was on fire and they abandoned ship. Due to kamikazes, and he used to, I guess, they would go out with the SPD as a tail gunner. And his duty, though, was a mechanic. That's what he trained for in the service. And but they finally decided that they could train a gunner easier than they could a mechanic. So he was restricted to, and he said his duty station was on deck when they were launching the bombers there. And so he had quite an experience, and he was away from home all the time. And I guess his wife decided that it was wanted him to get out, so he did, and couldn't find a job. So he joined the Army, thinking that he would be home more. Well, anyway, he wound up in the program that I was involved in.
since you got back to the States and over the years, have you met guys that were evacuated or talked to guys that were in Korea in different capacities? Have you just met any of the GIs that might have been somebody you evacuated, or,
Well, did I ever run into any of them?
yeah. Mm-hmm.
No, and none that have flown. A lot of times I see somebody with peg legs on them. I always go visit with them and find out where they were. Most of them I talk to nowadays are from Vietnam or various other places. But mines and mortars were the biggest ones that would fly someone back to the hospital, some out to the hospital ships. There was 4 different hospital ships. The U.S. the Hope, the Repose, the Haven, and the USS Constitution, and they would come in on a rotation basis, and depend upon, and at least I was told. I can't say for sure but most of them were the back injuries, head injuries. The conditions on board ship was more sanitary than they might have been.
Did you stay in the service long after Korea?
No, I got out and got married about then. I almost went back in and went down to the recruiter, and they said, "Well, we don't need to." Well, he was wrong. I talked to my brother-in-law later. He says, "Come on out here." He said, "We'll get you back in." And I could have been a flight instructor, and I enjoy a certain amount of flight instructor. I don't want to get into a day-long rat race out there, because this last student of the day is catching heck for every mistake the rest of them made, you know. So anyway, I didn't want to get back into flight instructing particularly, but I guess it would have been a good job though. But I stayed out and eventually ran in civilian life, and I've got that's a whole different world too.
Did you get to reunions after you got back from the war?
We didn't have our first reunion for 35 years, and that's when they had built this brand new museum and so forth. And George had been telling us about the museum and how supposedly we were represented. Well, we got in there and there's nothing about the Korean War and all about Vietnam. And since we were the very beginning, we were the beginning of the first group of flying warrant officers. They said the reason we were flying, they didn't have time to train us to become a commissioned officer. And a warrant officer is a specialist in all those branches. And that's what we were, as helicopter specialists. And that's what they continued on during the Vietnam War. They were all flying warrant officers, except for the commission for the administration. So I guess we proved that the warrant officer program was a valid deal, even going over there with minimal flight time. Of course, we were all rated pilots before, but only about 60-some helicopter hours, which is practically nothing for a beginning student, but we all survived.
Have they updated that museum yet to show?
All that, I started, my mind bounces back and forth, but we found out they had no representation for what we did in Korea. And when they first decided to have this first reunion, 35 years later, the only thing they had was maybe the individuals, maybe half a dozen. Maybe they thought, well, they knew somebody, and then maybe somebody else. And they gradually we got about 25 to 30 that they'd finally located. And so that was what our first reunion was. So we decided that there needed to be some representation for the group. And I'm not sure which one it was. Anyway, one of the individuals located Orlando Helicopters had been flying some of their surplus H-19s that we flew. And one of them was out in the swamp out there, dead, like in the scrapyard, in other words. And so they decided to buy it from them, or see if they would sell it or give it to us, and hired them to refurbish the helicopter to where it looks like it would fly, but it wouldn't. In other words, it's just a photo, so to speak. And we raised about $60,000 to have Orlando Helicopter go through and get it into the position. Then we presented it then through another reunion to the Army and get it on display then as being the original one of the cargo helicopters. So anyway, we were pretty upset that we were the forgotten war, Harry Truman's police action.
That's awful. And it was so true, wasn't it? It
Yeah.
just